All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to reconvene the Interstate Fisheries Management Policy Board, and we're going to begin our joint meeting with the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. I'm joined up here by the chair of the council, Wes Townsend. Welcome, Wes. Also joined by some staff that's going to go through our first measure, which is to consider approval of the recreational measure setting process. Going to be joined by Chelsea, Tracy, and Julia. So I appreciate that. Want to welcome all the council members, both in person and virtually. Glad to have you folks here. Special welcome to Joe Grist. Joe, it's good to see you. I have a question. Are you sitting for both council and board today?
Yes, Chairman, I'm sitting for both.
Just wanted to check. Thank you so much. Okay. So we'll consider ourselves called to order. And I'm not sure who on staff. Chelsea, are you going to start us off?
I believe John is actually going to start us off with an update before staff goes into our presentation.
Yep, I'm glad you had that. Okay, so with that, apologies. I'm actually going to turn it over to General Counsel, John Almeida.
Thanks, Joe. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
All right, thank you. For those who listened in to the GC update at the most recent council meeting, this summary I'm going to give on the court decision in NRDC v. Raimondo might sound familiar. Before I begin, I will note that the court's decision is still subject to appeal. The time for that runs out in a few weeks. The NRDC case challenged the council's and the commission's summer flounder, scup, black sea bass framework 17, which set up the new percent change approach for the development of recreational management measures. The plaintiffs in the case also challenged the application of this framework, this new approach, in the development of rec measures for 2023, 24, and 25. The plaintiff in the case argued that the new approach violated the annual catch limit provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And, kind of the overall conclusion, the court rejected these claims and ruled in favor of NIMFs. And in doing so, provided some useful guidance as the council and the commission are working on the replacement for Framework 17. Excuse me. First, the court recognized that recreational and commercial sectors are very different. The court recognized that the recreational and commercial sectors are very different and pointed out that this is reflected in the law in provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the 2018 Modernizing Recreational Fisheries Management Act. The court noted that the monitoring of catch data in the two sectors is very different, with the commercial sector having dealer and vessel reporting that allow for timely, accurate tracking of commercial harvest, while the recreational catch is monitored through survey-based systems that are less timely and have more uncertainty to them. The court pointed out that the specifications process by which, OFL, ABC, ACL, RHL are developed, that process was not changed by Framework 17. The change that the new process provides is the use of the recreational harvest target in the development of recreational management measures, which the prior approach used the RHL as the target. Importantly, the court found that this different approach complied with the legal requirements of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, both in the framework and in its use in the 2023, 24, and 25 rec measures rule. The court found that the use of recreational ACLs in the specifications process and the corresponding accountability measures for potential recreational overages satisfied the Magnuson-Stevens Act's ACL requirements. The court rejected the argument that the development of recreational measures must be tethered exclusively to a target of the RHL. The court found that the harvest control rules goal of reducing fluctuations in management measures struck a balance between National Standard 1's two aims of preventing overfishing and achieving optimal yield on a continuing basis. The court stated that the prior approach, which required recreational measures to aim for the RHL, balanced these two concepts differently with less of a regard for optimal yield. The main difference between the two approaches is the extent to which recreational measures are adjusted in a given year to bring recreational catch closer to the RHL or to aim directly for the RHL. The court found that the differences between recreational and commercial fishing and the associated differences in catch data were real, and that the harvest control rules approach reflects the difficulties with developing recreational measures in light of the uncertainties associated with recreational catch data. The court rejected the argument that these uncertainties were being double counted unlawfully, where they are considered in the development of the OFL and the ABC. The court pointed out that the Magnuson-Stevens Act expressly acknowledges the distinctions between recreational and commercial fishing, and that scientific and management approaches should be adapted to the characteristics of each sector, and that this is an example of how that can play out. Finally, the court rejected an argument that the harvest control rule amounts to a reallocation of quota from the commercial sector in the event of recreational overages. The court pointed out that to the extent there's an overage of a recreational ACL, the relevant accountability measures would address that. The only Magnuson concern that a commercial underharvest would address is in the determination of overfishing in the sense of a biological concern. And in that circumstance, the biological impact of the two sectors' combined harvests are necessarily considered together. However, that doesn't change the ACL AM framework, and to the extent that it was a recreational overage alone that caused caused an overage, it would be the recreational AM that would be triggered. So that's, a kind of a short summary of a 60-something page court decision. And I think the takeaway that I would offer is that the court resoundingly affirmed the approach that the council and commission took with regard to the framework 17 harvest control rule percent change approach. And to the extent that we are taking similar approaches in this action, I think this opinion gives us a solid legal footing to do so. That's all I have, Joe. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. Are there any questions for John? No hands in the room, online? Not seeing it. Okay, well, thank you again, John. Much appreciated for that. So with that, we will get into our agenda item of considering approval of rec measure setting process addenda framework for public comment. So I think now we're going to Chelsea. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I could not be in the room today. But today, Tracy, Julia, and I are going to give you all an overview of the recreational measure setting process framework addenda that was sent around as part of the meeting materials for this meeting. Next slide, please. So getting right into it, we're going to start off with some background on this action, followed by an overview of the options under consideration. We will also discuss some other topics that were considered by the FMAP and PDT since the policy board and council last met in August. And then we'll wrap up today with a timeline and next steps. And the objective of the meeting today is for the policy board to approve the draft addenda for public comment and for the council to approve the final range of alternatives or options. Next slide, please. So walking through some of the key sections of the draft addenda, starting with the statement of the problem. The statement of the problem describes how the commission and council face many challenges when setting recreational measures for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish, including concerns related to uncertainty and variability in the recreational fishery catch estimates, and the need to frequently change measures based on those data, especially in a direction that is often perceived as contrary to stock status. And then additionally, the interim approach to address these challenges that we are currently using, the percent change approach, will sunset at the end of 2025. And if a new process for setting recreational management measures for the 4 species is not implemented through this action, we will revert back to the previous method of setting recreational measures that aim to achieve but not exceed the recreational harvest limit, or RHL. Next slide, please. Following the statement of the problem in the document is the goal. And as discussed at previous meetings, the goal of the recreational measure setting process, framework, and addenda is to consider the process for setting recreational measures for 2026 and beyond for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. Next slide, please. The full FMAT and PDT met twice between the August Council and Policy Board meeting and this meeting, and made a number of changes to the options included in the draft addenda since these two bodies last met. These changes include the addition of option D, which is the modified percent change approach using the recreational ACT and catch, revisions to option E, which include a name change from the biomass-based matrix approach to the biomass and fishing mortality matrix approach, among other changes to that option. There's some additional language on management uncertainty, clarification of accountability measures under all options, and further discussion on impacts to the commercial sector, which is a topic that the Council and Policy Board directed the FMAT and PDT to explore further back in June of 2022. All of these changes were summarized in a memo that was addressed to the Policy Board and Council that went out as part of the supplemental materials for this meeting. Next slide, please. So that wraps up what I have for the background. We're going to move into the options in the document. Next slide. And before starting off with option A, I just wanted to make a quick note about overfished stocks and rebuilding plans. So as a reminder, none of the options in the draft addenda replace rebuilding plan measures. For example, bluefish is currently under a rebuilding plan, and any measures for bluefish must comply with that rebuilding plan that is outlined in Amendment 2 to the Bluefish FMP. But because it can take up to 2 years for a rebuilding plan to be implemented after a stock is declared overfished, the options in the document can be used as temporary measures in that interim period between when a stock is declared overfished and a rebuilding plan is implemented. And options C through E outline specific circumstances for these situations with overfished stocks. Next slide, please. Now moving into the options. Option A represents the no action option. So for this option, the percent change approach will sunset at the end of 2025, and the previous FMP requirements for the 4 species will be used for setting 2026 measures. And that process, again, is where measures must aim to achieve but not exceed the RHL and are set for 1 year at a time. And moving forward, it's anticipated that for these 4 species, stock assessments will be available every 2 years. So given this information, the remainder of the options, so options B through E in this document, allow for the setting of recreational measures on a 2-year timeline. But the no action option is year by year recreational measures. Next slide, please. Option B in the document is the percent change approach as currently implemented. So for this option, as everyone is aware, the first step in the process is the comparison of the RHL in the upcoming 2 years to a confidence interval around an estimate of expected harvest under status quo measures. Then, depending on if the 2-year RHL is above, below, or within the confidence interval of expected harvest under status quo measures, we move into that middle column, which is the biomass compared to the target. And so for this option, there are 3 levels of biomass considered, which are very high, which is above 150% of the target, high, which is between 100 and 150% of the target, and low, which is below 100% of the target. And then depending on the biomass category that the stock falls into, this then determines the percent reduction or liberalization needed in the upcoming 2 years, which is in that far right column. And I'm now gonna pass it over to Julia, who's gonna cover the next 2 options in the document and the associated accountability measures.
Thanks, Chelsea. So this is Julia Beatty with Mid-Atlantic Council staff, for those of you who don't know me. So as previously mentioned, we have laid out how accountability measures, or AMs, would work under all of the options. AMs are included in the council's FMP based on the requirements of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the National Standard Guidelines. AMs are management controls to prevent ACLs or annual catch limits from being exceeded and to correct or mitigate overages of the ACL if they occur. So although the AMs are not included in the Commission's FMP, the intent is that both the Council and the Policy Board will consider how AMs fit within this management action. So there are alternatives for AMs and descriptions of AMs included in the draft addenda for the Commission. So I'm going to describe the some commonalities across the multiple alternatives for the AMs. So in terms of how they are triggered, that's what's shown on the slide here. This would be the same across options A through D with some slightly different nuances for option E. And then in terms of what happens after they are triggered, it's treated the same for options A and B. So I will describe that on the next slide. So what this slide is showing is that the accountability measures, reactive accountability measures, are triggered when the most recent 3-year average recreational catch exceeds the associated average recreational ACL for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. And for bluefish, it's based on the most recent single year comparison to determine the ACL overage. The reason for that difference is because bluefish, that FMP allows transfers between the commercial and recreational sectors. That's not currently allowed for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. So the ability to do those transfers poses challenges for using a multi-year average for bluefish. So again, under most options in this document, everything but option E, there would be no changes to what's shown on the screen here in terms of how the AMs are triggered. The FMET and PDT reviewed this and thought about the Magnuson Act and National Standard Guidelines language regarding AMs, and especially in terms of how AMs are tied closely to ACLs. The FMET and PDT agreed that no changes are needed to this part of the AMs because it's appropriately tying the AMs to ACL overages. So then the next slide summarizes what happens when an AM is triggered under options A and B. So as a reminder, option A is the no action alternative and option B is the currently implemented percent change approach. So what's shown on the screen here is the accountability measures that are currently in place and would remain unchanged under options A and B. I'm not going to read all the details out loud, but key points are that the required AM response varies based on stock status. So for example, when the stock is overfished under rebuilding plan or stock status is unknown, then the exact amount of the overage must be paid back. And in other cases, there's either a smaller scale of payback and the scale of that payback is tied to the biomass level, or measures are adjusted in a way that takes into account the performance of the measures and the conditions that precipitated the overage. So next, I will summarize options C and D, which are two modified versions of the percent change approach. We did cover option C in detail during the August meeting of the Council and Policy Board, and at that time, both groups approved it for moving forward in this action. So I'm not going to repeat all of those details. Option D is new since the August meeting, but it's very similar to option C. It's just swapping out harvest with catch and the RHL with the ACT. So to give you a refresher of what we covered in August, the three key differences between these two modified percent change approaches and the currently implemented percent change approach are shown on the screen here. These are based on lessons learned over the past few years of actually using the percent change approach and some feedback that we've gotten in various ways. So first, this adds a new biomass category. So instead of the 3 categories, there's now 4, and it's a new category for stocks that are around the target level. So it could be a little bit above or a little bit below, but it's around the target, so it has its own biomass category, as opposed to the currently implemented percent change approach. It split stocks that were anything above or below 100% of the target were treated differently. So we thought it would be more appropriate to have a separate category for stocks that are close to the target level or around the target level. This also includes more status quo outcomes and treats overfished stocks separately. So the next slide shows what the new table would look like. Again, not going to walk through it in great detail because it was covered in August, but key points are that that first column is the same as the current percent change approach. And then the middle column, the biomass compared to the target level, you can see that has the addition of the around the target category. Overfished stocks are pulled out separately. And then on the right-hand column, there's more options for status quo here than there are under option B. So that middle row that's in white, that used to be split out into 3 separate categories. Now it's all collapsed together with a status quo outcome. And then the cells directly above and below that are also a status quo outcome. And then at the bottom, you can see how overfished stocks would be treated differently. So again, the intent here is that this is describing what happens when a stock has been declared overfished, but the rebuilding plan is not yet in place. And it can take up to 2 years to get a rebuilding plan implemented. So in that interim period, this would specify that no liberalizations are allowed because the stock is overfished. And if a reduction is needed, the percent reduction would be equal to, it would basically be aimed at achieving the RHL. And that these measures would be replaced with rebuilding plan measures as soon as possible. And then the next slide shows option D, and everything on this table is the same as on the previous table, except that the RHL is swapped out with the ACT and harvest is swapped out with catch. So the intent of this option would be to focus more on how measures are impacting total dead catch and not just harvest. So this is something that's come up a lot in the past, is that our process through now has been focused on achieving a target level of harvest. So sometimes we could need to restrain measures in a way that there's concern that that could reduce harvest, but also increase discards. So if we focus more on the amount of total dead catch that measures are expected to achieve, maybe we could do a better job of accounting for discards when setting measures. So that's the intent of, again, keeping this option the same as option C. So incorporating all those lessons learned from the current percent change approach, but also focusing on catch instead of harvest, and using the ACT or the annual catch target as the starting consideration, because that allows us to incorporate management uncertainty buffers if desired. So then the next slide describes a sub-alternative for the accountability measures under options C and D. So there's 2 sub-options for accountability measures for these alternatives, and it's the same sub-options repeated across options C and D. So again, C and D are both the modified percent change approach options. Since they're so similar to each other, we thought they could consider the same accountability measures across the 2. So the first sub-option that applies to both C and D would be sub-option C1 and then corresponding D1. This is the same as the current accountability measures, but with a few modifications. The modifications are shown here with a red line version. So under the biomass level column, it would just switch out the target level for 90% of the target level. And that's just aimed at aligning the way the AMs would work with how the biomass category is treated under that table I showed on the previous slide, where the around the target biomass category starts at 90%. So if we didn't make that change, we would have part of the around the target category falling into one cell of the AM table, and then another part of that category falling into a different cell. So we thought, just to make it line up better, just change it so that the biomass categories align in the way shown on the screen here. And then the other adjustments shown in the bottom right in green, the current accountability measures say that adjustments to recreational measures will be made when an AM is triggered and biomass is above the target. But we could be in a situation where a liberalization could be allowed, and we might want to have a status quo approach instead of a liberalization as an accountability measure. And the way the regulations are currently phrased poses challenges for that, because it says that adjustments to measures will be made. So the intent of changing will to may is for situations like that, where status quo might be appropriate as an AM. And then also there's additional text to say that if a liberalization is allowed, then the scale of the liberalization may be reduced to count for the AM. And each year that we go through the process to consider what the appropriate AM response is, it would be up to the monitoring committee to weigh in on some of the specifics about when you're in one of these outcomes where it's not a specific payback, then you need to figure out what measures are appropriate for meeting the requirements there when it's not as specifically laid out. But again, this is modeled on the current AMs with just some minor tweaks. And then the next slide is additional sub options under those modified percent change approaches that incorporates all those tweaks that I described on the previous slide, but it also adds in on the AM response column some situations where an AM response would not be needed. This is only when an AM or there was an ACL overage, the AM was triggered, but based on the most recent information, it did not result in overfishing. So this alternative or this option, the sub option, would change it so that if the stock is not overfished, it's not under rebuilding plan, you're in one of these other biomass categories, the ACL was exceeded, but overfishing did not occur, then you would not need an AM response. But it does clarify that if overfishing did occur, then you would either have a scaled payback or you would adjust measures depending on which biomass category you fall into. So the FMAT and PDT talked about this and thought this would be an appropriate change. They also noted that these changes are actually pretty similar to the current commercial accountability measures when the overage is due all or in part to discards for the commercial sector. A similar outcome is allowed here. So that is it for my slides, and I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to cover option E.
Thanks, Julia. As Julia mentioned, I will be covering option E, as well as touching on some other topics discussed by the FMAP PDT since our last meeting, the August meeting, and then finishing up with timeline and next steps. So for option E, the biomass-based matrix approach was considered through the previous option and was further developed in this framework addenda. After much discussion after the August meeting, the FMAP PDT ended up modifying this option enough that we've renamed it the biomass and fishing mortality matrix approach. So the name was basically appropriate for the approach. This new option is shown on the screen and uses several factors to determine how to set measures. The first being spawning stock biomass compared to the target level, and now fishing mortality compared to the threshold as defined by the most recent stock assessment, as well as the most recent recreational annual catch limit, ACL, has been exceeded. And please note that AMs are incorporated into this alternative, so I will be addressing them as we go along as appropriate. The biomass categories, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, are similar to those that were described for the modified percent change approach, except a near overfish category has been added to allow for increased precaution when biomass is 50 to 60% of the target. In addition, high and very high were combined into an above the target category to reduce some of the complexity in this option. I will begin with reviewing outcomes for if overfishing is not occurring, and then I will get onto the move into the right-hand side of the slide of the table, which covers outcomes when overfishing is occurring, and explain the FMAP PDT's rationale for the additional bins. As I explain this option, you'll notice that outcomes are more complex, specifically for stocks that are above the target or around the target. This is because the FMAP PDT gave special consideration to what management actions were most appropriate for stocks with higher spawning stock biomass in the different situations proposed in this option. So to start, if a stock is above the target, meaning biomass compared to the target level is equal to or over 110% and overfishing is not occurring, this option allows a 10% liberalization. Every time a stock falls into this bin, each cycle, the recreational fishery is allowed a 10% liberalization. Now, if the stock is around the target, meaning if biomass compared to the target level is greater than or equal to 90% up to 110%, and again, overfishing is not occurring, measures will remain status quo. So before we move into the categories for overfishing, I wanted to just touch on the FMAP PDT's rationale specifically for these categories. The FMAP PDT wanted to take into account several other considerations they thought may be important when deciding how recreational management measures may need to be adjusted for stocks with higher biomass in this option. First, if a stock has high biomass or biomass around the target and is only a few percentage points over the overfishing threshold, the FMAP PDT thought it may not be necessary or beneficial for the recreational fishery to be required what could be end up being a very large reduction, especially if the stock's doing really well and the fishing mortality rate is so close to the threshold. This led to the creation of a 5% cutoff point. Stocks with biomass around or above the target and are fishing close to within 5% of the fishing mortality at the maximum sustainable yield may remain status quo in this option. In addition, the FMAP PDT also thought if overfishing was occurring over the 5% cutoff point for stocks with spawning stock biomass around or above the target, it would be important to also take into consideration whether the recreational catch for that fishery exceeded the annual catch limit, the ACL, in the previous year, or in other words, if the recreational sector contributed to the overfishing status. I will discuss the outcomes for these considerations in the next slides. So we will start off when biomass is around or above the target. There are two fishing mortality categories that give you the same results, status quo. First, when overfishing is occurring up to the 5% cutoff point. The second category is when overfishing is occurring by more than 5% and last year's recreational ACL was not exceeded, again, meaning that the recreational fishery did not contribute to overfishing. Again, the status quo outcome only occurs when we have a larger spawning stock biomass. And as you can see in the red box, it notes the status quo outcome may not be applicable if an accountability measure has been triggered. And as Julia went over earlier, it's similar. An AM will be triggered for salmon, flounder, scup, and black sea bass if the most recent 3-year average ACL is exceeded. And the rec AM for bluefish would be triggered based on an overage in the most recent single-year recreational ACL. So if overfishing is occurring by more than 5% and last year's recreational ACL was exceeded, meaning the recreational fishery did contribute to overfishing, then this approach calls for reductions. For stocks with biomass above the target, consideration is given to this high biomass. If it is the first time a stock is entered, the overfishing is occurring by more than 5% and recreational ACL was exceeded, then the recreational fishery would need to take a 10% reduction in catch. If in the next cycle the stock falls into the same bin again, the catch would then need to be reduced to achieve the recreational ACT with a minimum of a 10% reduction. The reasoning behind this stepwise approach was to try to mitigate impacts of a large reduction by initially requiring that flat 10% reduction. And if the stock continues to fall into the same category, then catch will need to be reduced to achieve the recreational ACT. In comparison, the FMAP PDT is recommending stocks with biomass around the target that fall into this bin should be treated more cautiously compared to stocks with biomass above the target. So in this case, the recreational fishery would have to reduce catch to achieve the recreational ACT with a minimum reduction of 10%. For stocks that have low or near overfished biomass, the response is much more straightforward. Stocks that fall into these bins would have to reduce catch to achieve the recreational ACT, with a minimum of 10% reduction required for stocks with low biomass and a minimum 20% reduction required for near overfished stocks. In both cases, if an AM is triggered, scaled overage payback will be deducted from the ACT, and more information about that can be found in the framework addenda. Finally, as with the other modified percent change approach options, we have separated out overfished stocks into their own category with no liberalizations allowed, and reductions are required as needed to achieve the recreational ACT until rebuilding plan is put into place. So since this option is fairly complex, I wanted to go through it again using a different perspective of a decision tree to walk through the decision-making process and figuring out what bin a stock falls into. In this option, the first question we ask is how the spawning stock biomass of the stock compares to the target level. If the stock is above the target, you then need to ask the question shown here in the blue outlined diamonds, what is the fishing mortality compared to the threshold for overfishing? I'm first going to go through the outcomes for a stock that is above the target. So for stocks above the target where fishing mortality compared to the overfishing threshold is less than or equal to 100%, i.e. overfishing is not occurring, a stock can take a 10% localization. For stocks that overfishing is occurring up to 105%, measures can remain status quo. If fishing mortality compared to the overfishing threshold is greater than 105%, then you need to ask the question, was the recreational ACL exceeded last year? If it wasn't, measures can remain status quo. If the recreational ACL was exceeded last year, the first time the stock falls into this bin requires a 10% reduction. If the stock remains in this bin, then catch needs to be reduced to achieve the recreational ACT with a minimum reduction of 10%. Next, I'll go through the outcomes for a stock that is around the target. Again, we're asking the question in the blue diamond, what is fishing mortality compared to the overfishing threshold? If it's less than or equal to 105%, then measures can remain status quo. If a stock is overfishing by over 105%, then we need to ask the question of whether the recreational ACL was exceeded. If it wasn't, measures can remain status quo. If the recreational ACL was exceeded, then it has the same outcome as a stock that falls into the low biomass category. We will need to reduce catch to achieve the recreational ACT with a minimum reduction of 10%. For stocks that are near overfished with a B over BMSY of around 50 to 60% as a reminder, then we'll need to reduce catch to achieve the recreational ACT with a minimum reduction of 20%. Finally, when a stock is overfished, again, no liberalizations allowed, and you will need to reduce catch to achieve the rec ACT or follow the rebuilding plan once established. So again, when you put that all together, this is the decision tree, and it is found within the framework addenda document if you wish to look through it some more. So finally, moving on to other topics. These are two topics that have been, again, further developed by the FMAP PDT since August. The Policy Board and Council had previously requested the FMAP PDT consider how management uncertainty may interact with the options in this document. The figure on the right side of the slide illustrates a very simplified version of how the OFL relates to the ABC, ACL, ACT, etc. The recreational ACT is highlighted in the figure in blue, and the ACT is set less than or equal to the ACL to account for management uncertainty. None of the options in this document change the process for setting the recreational ACT. And as a reminder, the modified percent change approach and the biomass and fishing mortality matrix approach, the ACT was selected to be included rather than the recreational ACL in the event that management uncertainty buffers are used in the future. In the draft framework addenda document, it's noted that under all options, the Policy Board and Council may set more restrictive recreational measures than would otherwise be required to address management uncertainty or concerns about long-term sustainability of the stock. The intent of this addition is to allow the board and council to make adjustments if desired when setting recreational measures, which typically takes place after the ACT has been set. So this can allow for potentially finer scale adjustments. So moving on to impacts to the commercial sector. Although this action only considers a process for setting recreational measures, the Council and Policy Board had requested the FMAP PDT further evaluate potential indirect impacts to the commercial sector. So this action does not consider changes to commercial management. It does not consider transferring quota between commercial and recreational sectors or modify allocations, and it is not intended to lead to future revisions of the commercial and recreational allocations, and it does not change the process for setting the recreational and commercial ACLs, ACTs, and landing limits. The council had also tasked the Scientific and Statistical Committee, SSC, with reviewing several aspects of this management action, including potential indirect impacts to the commercial sector. The outcome of the SSC review is summarized in their July 2024 report, but I am going to summarize some of their points related to this topic. The SSC noted, as was previously noted in the SSC's review of the draft Harvest Control Rule Framework Addenda, that the setting of recreational measures does not directly impact ABC recommendations. However, the SSC did note that if the frequency of ABC overages increased, they may assume that ABC overages in the projections that inform ABCs. This would have the effect of reducing the ABCs, which would in turn reduce the catch and landing limits for both the commercial and recreational sectors. Due to the council's risk policy, this has a greater impact for stocks below 150% of their biomass target. However, the FMAP PDT notes that if the process in place for determining management measures results in an ACL overage, the recreational AMs can be triggered, which can help prevent the recreational sector's catch from deviating greatly from its ACL over time. The SSC report did not explicitly consider the role of AMs in this process. The FMAP PDT's recommendations regarding the AMs as they relate to the options were not fully developed at that time. So finally, moving into timeline and next steps. So our overall timeline for this management action, we are here as indicated by the red arrow. In order to remain on schedule, the Council and Policy Board will need to approve the final range of alternatives and draft addenda for public comment at this meeting. This timeline is fairly strict in order to meet the goal of implementing the selected option, or the option is ultimately selected to set recreational measures for 2026. As you probably remember, the Harvest Control Rule percent change approach sunsets at the end of next year, which means final action for this management action would need to be in place, or would need to take place in April 2025. So that leads me to the conclusion of our presentation. The Policy Board will be considering approval of the draft addenda for public comment, and the Council is considering approving the range of alternatives. And as a reminder or for reference, the options under consideration are provided in the blue box. And thank you, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Tracy, Julia, and Chelsea. Once the council and commission's head stops spinning, I'll open it up for questions. A lot of stuff to be considering here, and also considering that we're taking this out to the public. Questions? Adam.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the work the PDT has done getting us to this point. The issue of moving from a harvest to catch-based management has certainly been something that there's been a lot of discussion about. Certainly something that I see merits to moving forward. Looking backwards, when the percent change approach was last developed, PDT members, Dustin Colson-Leaning, who was a former commissioner staff member, and Mike Celestino from the PDT at the time had proceeded to complete a fairly robust review of past performance of recreational harvest compared to RHLs. And that review and analysis was used to inform the 10, 20, and 40% numbers that were used in the percent change approach that's currently been implemented and supported by the current legal review that we heard at the beginning of the presentation. Can you confirm that for the carryover of those numbers into option D at present time, that those numbers 0, 10, 20, and 40% were just carried over from the existing percent change approach, and there wasn't as robust of a analysis as had been previously carried out of RHL to rec harvest comparison that was done for ACL and rec catch.
That's correct. We have not done a similar analysis. This option, like I said, was added between August and now. So we did briefly talk about that with the FMAT and PDT, and we just felt that we didn't have time to do something like that. And if we did, I think we would have to think about how to do it differently, because in the past we were trying to set measures to achieve a target level of harvest, the RHL. We weren't trying to achieve a certain level of catch. So we could have had discards that I think it would be challenging to do that same analysis looking back at historical data, because we just weren't setting measures to achieve a target based on catch. So it might not be comparable. We could go about it a different way potentially, but we would have to talk through how we would do that. But the short answer is, yeah, we just carried over those percentages. We did have an analysis with using the recreation demand model that I guess that only looked at harvest too, but confirmed that 10%, we felt like that was an acceptable minimum. But the 20 and 40 was largely based on information, like a historical retrospective. And I think that side of things would be harder to do looking at catch.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the great presentations, Julie and Tracy. I always find it easiest for me to understand when I look at an example like in Table 5. I was just curious, in Table 5, I think it would be really helpful for the public too, because it shows real world implications of each option. But under option C and D, is this going to be the same for option C1 and C2 and D1 and D2? Because the table just says option C and option D.
So the C1 and D1 would only come into play if an AM is triggered. So we can't really predict how that would impact the specific resulting percentage. But assuming an AM is not triggered, it would, be the way it's. Then that's what the example was based on.
Nicola, and also, sorry, just one second. Also, if anyone online, please raise your hands from council and commission members.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the team. I really appreciate all the thought that went into these options. I think it's often more difficult to come up with the processes than it is, when we're just thinking about actually setting the measures. But in option E, one of the distinctions that I noticed is that when you're reducing or liberalizing, there isn't a cap at it like there is in the other options. I'm wondering if that was part of the FMAT discussion at all, and if you think that the way it's set up, it'll still avoid those really significant changes that the other options kind of put a cap on and don't have set at 20% or 40% max depending on stock status.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, I think this was something the FMAT PDT discussed quite a bit when trying to put together this or make the changes to this option. I know we talked about, like you said, there's no cap. So every time, let's say a stock falls into that 10% liberalization bin, it's going to just keep compounding. But we had discussed how if the stock, started getting closer to the target, it would move down to that status quo bin, and that would keep it level. Or basically, it's supposed to checks and balances almost within this option is what we were talking about. And as for the reductions in this option, we had been mainly focusing on spawning stock biomass and how that was doing. So if a stock was low, near overfished, that's when we decided we probably shouldn't have a cap in that instance, at least for this option, because if a stock's doing that badly, we probably need to meet or reduced catch to achieve the recreational ACT. But we had a little more flexibility when the stock was doing better, when it was above the target or around the target, where we would maybe just do status quo or cut it at 10%. So yeah, we tried to take it into consideration when we were developing this option.
Yes, sorry, Megan.
Thanks, and just want to compliment the staff on how well you guys presented on some really difficult topics. This is really complex stuff. You guys did a great job at that. My question's also on option E, and I guess I'm hoping you can just maybe speak a little bit more to the green box where it's status quo, but overfishing is occurring either by 5% or more than 5%. And just wanting to understand, I assume that's overfishing coming from an assessment, so a stock-wide measure of overfishing. And then I'm wondering if you can speak to like how that meets or matches requirements to end overfishing for a stock. And I'm just trying to think through it in my mind, like if we get an overfishing result out of an assessment, the typical steps we take after that, and how that aligns with what I'm seeing in the green boxes.
Yeah, I think that result, if overfishing is happening greater than over 105%, and status quo being an option at that point, we were thinking only when the stock is doing really, really well would we maybe consider that as an option. And we also had that qualifier in there that if the recreational fishery wasn't contributing to that overfishing status, then we would just keep things how they were essentially. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to add to that. Anything I'm missing? Yeah.
Maybe just another way to frame the question. So I think sometimes when you get an overfishing status, it requires you to reduce the overall quota. So presumably the commercial fishery may be looking at a reduction and the rec fishery at status quo. Obviously, you can also have a situation where you're overfishing and maybe you have a big year class coming in. So the next year you're projected not to be overfishing just because of the biomass. So in that case, it's not as big of a discrepancy maybe between the sectors. But again, I'm just trying to think through how that would work for, each sector.
Oh, and yeah, I guess this relates to this. One thing I forgot to mention is that when we were having the discussions about something like status quo, if a stock is being, if overfishing is occurring, we did note in our discussions that the Council and Policy Board would have the discretion to put in stricter regulations if they were concerned. If if it was overfishing by 175% or something like that, it's like status quo is not going to be acceptable at this point. We need to do something else. The Council and Policy Board have that option.
Good, Megan. Okay. Look around the room and online again for Council and Commission questions. Okay, not seeing any. We're going to open it up to the public for questions of staff. Mike Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. I guess I'll just make a quick comment while I'm at the mic that these are going to be some tricky public hearings with how complicated the nature of this document and the options are. I think staff did a really good job trying to lay out the flow charts of how this would work. And on some of the previous public hearings I've been on, I think the polling option might be a good avenue to go for this, specifically trying to lay out kind of the polls relative to the flow charts that you guys put together. That might be a helpful technique. Getting to my question, it's regarding the bluefish accountability measures, and I think it's best worded if transfers between the sectors don't occur for 3 years in a row, can a 3-year moving average be used as opposed to the 1 year? I believe that's only applicable to bluefish, so I think my question only applies there, but I guess I'll have a follow-up based on that answer.
So if there was not a transfer for the most recent 3 years, then that complication isn't there. But a change to the regulations would need to be made to allow for that to happen. So I don't know that it would be all that hard. It could just say, like, if a transfer has not occurred during these 3 years, it would require some regulation changes. So I think it would need to be in the document if there was a desire to make that change. That's just my initial reaction. I would also want Garfo to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn on that too.
Well, actually, well, go ahead, Mike Benton.
Actually, Julie, can you restate that? What you want me to weigh in on? Sorry.
Oh, that the question was, if we did not have a transfer in Bluefish for the most recent 3 years, could we use a 3-year average? And I said the regulations would need to change to make that happen. So that would need to be in the range of alternatives here.
Correct.
Follow up, Mike Wayne.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I mean, to me, it would make sense, given what we know about how infrequent transfers have been in the most recent history. I previously, before we were in a rebuilding plan, I think Bluefish did experience some sector transfers, but we haven't had those over several years. And I believe it would make sense to align the accountability measure time frame for which this is evaluated with the other species, summer flounders, cup black sea bass, if no transfers occurred in that most in 3 years. So I guess that would be a recommendation to the council and the commission to make that change before this document goes out to public comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you, Mike. That's much appreciated. That's why I'm glad we're taking some questions and comments from the public. I think I saw another hand in the room. Greg DiDomenico.
That's a much longer walk than I'm used to. Very dramatic. It's Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. Just a question for staff, Mr. Chairman. Twice during the presentation and then the back and forth between one of the commission members, you mentioned a phrase that was, if the recreational catch is contributing to overfishing. Can you expand upon that in how you mean it and how it relates to this action or the alternatives in the action?
Sorry, 1 second, trying to figure out. If we're basically equating, if the most recent recreational ACL is not exceeded, then that's equated to the recreational fishery is not contributing to overfishing.
So you mean overages, not a level of F that exceeds the threshold?
Correct. I guess it would be almost a proxy because we do not right now. Earlier in this action, we did try to separate out F, sector specific F, but we were, I wouldn't say not successful, but it needed more time to develop. So we weren't able to use a sector specific F in any of these options at this time.
So how does it relate to the alternatives? In other words, how does it relate to a possible 10% reduction status quo or 10% increase? That's the part I'm not understanding.
Sorry, I'm trying to think about how to answer that. I mean, in this option, if it's not exceeded, and this is only for stock status, if the stock is around the target or above the target, otherwise that does not get taken into consideration. Also, if it's a positive stock status, biomass is high, and the most recent recreational ACL is not exceeded, that's where a stock may be, or recreational measures may be able to remain status quo. And again, we have that qualified in there. If an AM is triggered, then that will not be the case, potentially. And then for, if the recreational ACL is exceeded, that's when we start getting into the 10% reduction, reducing catch to receipt, achieve the rec ACT, etc. So if the recreational fishery did contribute to overfishing, that's when we have the larger reductions for the above the target and around the target.
Thank you.
Don't see any other hands from the public. And again, thank you everyone on staff for fielding those questions. To Mike Wayne's question, and I believe he's right that we haven't done any transfers between sectors for bluefish for some time. If it would require a change, then I think the wording needs to get into this document and then would need to be part of a modification to this document when we're looking to make motions. And of course, that's, I think our next step is to look for motions to move the document forward. So I would ask that council and commission members consider that, and we can certainly help try and wordsmith that if there is interest. But okay, sorry, the little sidebar there was just simply that we do have motions to move this forward for anyone willing to start that process, and if there's general consensus around and no objection, then staff can work on the wordsmithing of adding that bluefish language. So look for motions, look for hands for motions. Jim, you'd be a good start.
Well, Karnak, oh, there it is. So I'll make that motion, move to approve draft addendum 30.
First, can we decide if we want to add that bluefish? Is there consensus to add the bluefish language or not?
Okay, Tony would like to see at least a nodding of heads that there is consensus to add the bluefish language. And thumbs up from Chris Bat Savage. Yes, nodding of head, bunch of thumbs up. Okay. All right, I would say that's general consensus. And Jim, you can make this on behalf of the council and commission, correct? And that's why I thought this would be a good start. So
yes, I can. So
great,
move to approve draft addendum 36 to the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass FMP, and draft addendum 3 to the bluefish FMP for public comment as presented as modified today.
Instead, say not.
Sorry, Tony. As modified today. And for the council, move to approve the range of options in the recreational measure setting process framework / addenda as modified today.
okay, looks like we're starting out with the board. So a second from the board, Joe Grist. Oh.
And Joe Grist also seconds for the council.
Yeah, excellent. Discussion, Adam Nowalski.
Great, thank you very much. I will certainly support both of these motions here today. I do have one request for an additional modification to the document though, and that would be as it particularly attains to this last example section here that talks about status quo catch and harvest. There's going to be a lot of confusion in the public that expected catch and harvest, either of those being status quo, is going to mean status quo measures in the coming spec cycle. But the reality is that with the use of the recreational demand model, that may not actually be the case. So my request for this document would be that some additional language be added here that spells out that expected status quo or catch, depending on an option, may ultimately not mean status quo measures moving forward.
Absolutely. Julie, you want to respond to that?
Just wanted to clarify, we can, if it's not clear, we can try to make it more clear in the document. And if we think that's a change that needs to be made, I don't know if the process is we work with leadership or something to make sure it's clear after today. But the intent was that you start, the first comparison is if you leave measures unchanged, what do you think harvest would be next year? So if that expectation is fine and that can stay status quo, then measures can stay unchanged. But we didn't want to say status quo measures because we wanted to leave in the flexibility for conservation equivalency tweaks to achieve the same level of harvest. But the expectation was, besides conservation equivalency, that it would be status quo measures, because it starts with that comparison of, if we leave measures unchanged, what do we think harvest would be next year?
Follow up, Adam?
Yeah, and I think as long as you provide that level of clarification, then that would satisfy that in terms of offering that additional explanation to the public. I appreciate it. I also want to add again that while I would support this today, when it comes time for final action, I'm going to have a very difficult time with these catch-based options. And that is based on the fact that there's been very limited analysis done as to whether the changes proposed in this document based on catch, they're not grounded in the same level of analysis that the percent changes were done for harvest. So given that the last action underwent a legal challenge, as was documented by legal counsel earlier today, his interpretation was that the most recent ruling gave us a solid basis moving forward to now be changing that from harvest to catch without that robust analysis. I will have a concern about that moving forward, but I think it's good to get this out to the public, get their thoughts on catch versus harvest moving forward. But I did want to put that reservation out there today.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Other comments on the board motion around the room or online? Okay. We're just checking online to make sure. Okay, no hands. So with that, I'll call the question to the board. Is there any objection to moving this forward? Not seeing any objection. Okay, passed by consent for the board. Turn it over to Wes.
Thank you. Does the council need to discuss this motion at all? Anyone around the room? Anything online? No hands online. Is there any objection to the motion? If you're on the line, please raise your hand. Okay, no hand, it passes unanimously. Thank you.
Okay, we're good there. Is there any other business to come before us? Still not seeing any hands. Excellent. So we will adjourn the policy board part of this and that part of the joint meeting. We will be picking up the Summer Flounders Cup and Black Sea Bass Management Board. I will be turning over the mic to the chair. And sorry, policy board needs a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Chris. There we go. Chris Batts, Avadrano, and thank you.